Hello and welcome. Tonight, I will tell you a quiet story about a dream and a destiny. It is a true story. It begins with a young boy named Louis in a small, faraway village in France. His world was cold and poor. But he did not know that a fire inside him and a special skill in his hands would one day change the world of luxury forever. Our story starts in the year 1821 in a tiny mountain village called Anche in the east of France. Life here was not easy. The winters were long and brutal, and cold wind whistled through the cracks of the small wooden houses. For most people, their world was confined to this village. In one of these houses lived the Vuitton family. They were poor but hard-working. Louis's father, Xavier, was a carpenter, and all day the sound of his hammer and saw echoed from his small workshop. He taught his son, young Louis, how to respect the wood, how to feel its grain, how to understand its shape, and how to make it strong. Louis's mother, Caron, was a hat maker. She spent her days sewing, her fingers moving quickly, turning simple straw and felt into hats for the local women. Louis learned from both of them, absorbing lessons about hard work and the intricate details of craftsmanship. However, his world remained very, very small. The village of Anche was situated on a road frequently used by travelers. Sometimes, large, fancy carriages would pass through its muddy streets. Louis would stop his work to watch these rich travelers from faraway cities like Paris. He observed their fine clothes and their heavy, impressive trunks. He wondered, where were they going? And what treasures were hidden in those beautiful, mysterious boxes? His life was defined by the cold wind and the smell of sawdust, while theirs was filled with adventure and mystery. He felt a strange curiosity, a pull toward something he could not yet name. Although he was just a poor carpenter's son, he was already watching the world change, unaware that this simple curiosity was the beginning of his destiny. For the next few years, Louis's life continued in this simple rhythm. He woke up early, the cold biting at his skin, and spent his days in his father's workshop. He loved the smell of the wood and the feeling of creating something new with his hands. He was a natural craftsman. His father, Xavier, recognized this talent and was proud of his son. He taught Louis everything he knew, how to choose the strongest oak, how to curve the wood without breaking it, and how to make a joint so perfect it looked invisible. Louis's hands, though young, became strong and skilled. He used to feel safe in that workshop. It was his whole world. But that sense of safety was about to shatter. When Louis was just 10 years old, his mother fell very sick. The village had no real doctors, and the cold winter was harsh. Louis watched, helpless, as she grew weaker until, one morning, she did not wake up. Caron, the hat maker, was gone. The small wooden house felt empty and silent, and the sound of his father's hammer stopped for a long time. Louis's world had fallen apart, and grief made his father a different man, quiet and distant. A few years later, his father married again. This new woman, his stepmother, did not bring warmth back to the house. Instead, she was a harsh, bitter woman. She saw Louis not as a son, but merely as another mouth to feed, and she was cruel to him. She disliked his quiet, thoughtful nature and disapproved of him spending so much time in the workshop. The house, which was once a home, now felt like a prison. The workshop became his only escape, where he would hide, working on small wooden boxes and dreaming of the travelers in their carriages. He was only 13 years old, but he knew he could not stay in that house. He had to leave. However, this difficult decision was only the beginning of his true hardship. The tension in the small house grew heavier every day. Louis's stepmother made his life impossible. Every small mistake was a reason for anger, and every quiet moment was filled with tension. Louis, now 13 years old, felt trapped. The fear of staying in that house finally became greater than the fear of leaving it. He knew what he had to do. He had heard the travelers talk about Paris, a city of lights, opportunity, and work. It was a city 470 kilometers away, almost 300 miles, seeming like the other side of the world, but it was his only hope. One cold night in 1835, Louis made his choice. He waited until the house was dark and silent, then quietly gathered his few belongings into a small cloth bag. He carried his carpenter's tools, given to him by his father, which were his only treasure. He had no money, no food for the journey, and not even a map, only a desperate hope and the skills in his hands. He opened the door, the sound terribly loud in the quiet night, looked back one last time at the house, then stepped out onto the dark, frozen road. He turned his face toward Paris and began to walk. He walked for days, then weeks, then months. The journey was more brutal than he could have imagined. He traversed through forests and fields, over hills and across empty plains. He slept in barns, under bridges, or sometimes just on the cold, hard ground, desperately hungry. To survive, he had to work, stopping in small towns along the way and finding any job he could. Because he was a skilled carpenter, he offered to fix a broken chair for a baker in exchange for bread, or helped a farmer mend a fence for a place. To sleep in the hay. He worked as a handyman, a laborer, anything to earn a few coins or a simple meal. He was alone, but he was not stopping. Despite having no money, no food, and no map, he pressed on. He thought the 2-year walk would be the hardest part of his life, but he was wrong. It took Louis Vuitton 2 full years. In 1837, at the age of 16, he finally walked through the gates of Paris. He was no longer a boy, but a young man, hardened by the road. He was tired, very tired, but he was alive, and he had arrived. Paris, however, was not the gentle dream he had imagined. It was a massive, roaring, overwhelming city. The noise was the first thing that hit him. The sound of 1,000 horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestone streets, the shouts of merchants, the bells of churches, and the constant hum of 1,000,000 people. It was a city of impossible contrasts. On one street, he saw grand palaces and beautiful ladies wearing silk gowns, protected by tall iron fences, where the air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh bread from the bakeries. Then, just one street over, he saw extreme poverty, with beggars having no shoes, children sleeping in doorways, and narrow alleys filled with mud and garbage. Louis had survived the long journey, but he had arrived with nothing. The few coins he had earned were gone, spent on scraps of food. He had no friends, no family, and nowhere to sleep. He was completely, terrifyingly alone. He had officially reached the point of no return. His old life in Anche was gone forever. He could not go back. He could only move forward. For weeks, he was homeless, sleeping where he could, in dark alleys, under bridges, or in the shadows of the very workshops he hoped to one day enter. He was cold, and his stomach was a constant aching pain. He had survived the journey, but now he had to survive Paris, and the city was ready to swallow him whole. Louis refused to be a victim. He had hands that knew how to work. He began walking the streets, knocking on the doors of every carpentry and coachmaking workshop he could find, but the answer was always no. They had no time for a homeless boy with no connections, but Louis was persistent. One day, he found his way to a street where the maletiers worked. These were the box makers and packers, craftsmen who made custom travel boxes for the wealthy. He found the workshop of Monsieur Maréchal, one of the most respected masters in Paris. Louis, thin and dirty from the street, stood at the door, and he didn't just ask for food or money, he asked for work. Monsieur Maréchal was a tough, older man. He had seen hundreds of boys like Louis, but he also saw something else in this one's eyes, a serious, determined fire. Furthermore, he noticed the boy's hands, which were already rough and calloused like a worker's, not a beggar's. He gave him a simple test, to saw a piece of wood. Louis's cut was straight, clean, and confident. Marshall grunted and gave him a job. It was the lowest job, sweeping the floor, cleaning the glue pots, and running errands. Louis didn't care. He had a roof over his head during the day and a purpose. This was Louis's new trial. He worked 16 hours a day, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He slept in a tiny attic room, which, though humble, was far better than the street. He diligently watched everything the master craftsmen did, studying how they planned a trunk, how they treated the wood, how they fitted the leather, and how they hammered the tiny nails. His real journey, his true education had begun. He was no longer just surviving, but truly learning. Months turned into years, and Louis remained patient, doing every dirty job without complaint. Slowly, Monsieur Maréchal gave him more important tasks. First, preparing the wood, then fitting the joints, and finally, building the boxes himself. Louis was not just good, he was exceptional. His background as a carpenter gave him a deep understanding of the wood, and his long, difficult journey had given him endless patience. He worked harder than anyone, not just building boxes, but building his new life. By the time he was a young man, he was no longer merely an apprentice. He had become the master craftsman, the best in the workshop. He was becoming the best craftsman in the shop, and soon the most powerful people in France would start to notice. By the 1850s, France was changing. The country was now an empire again, ruled by Napoleon III. His wife, the Empress Eugenie, was the most powerful woman in France, a leader of fashion who loved to travel. But she had a problem. Her beautiful, expensive gowns, with their wide skirts and delicate silks, were being crushed and ruined by the traditional round-topped travel trunks. The baggage handlers were rough and the boxes were impractical. She needed a better solution, a craftsman who understood both protection and elegance. Her staff searched for the best maletier in Paris, and they heard whispers about a brilliant young craftsman at Monsieur Maréchal's shop, someone whose skill was unmatched. His name was Louis Vuitton. This was the climax. It was not a battle of swords, but a quiet, intense test of skill. Louis, now a confident young man in his early 30s, was summoned to the royal palace. Imagine that moment. A boy who had walked to Paris with nothing, who had slept on the cold streets, was now walking through the golden halls of the palace. He stood before the Empress, his heart hammering, but his hands were steady. He knew this was his one great chance, and he could not and would not fail. The Empress explained her problem, and Louis listened intently. He didn't just listen, he understood deeply, for he was not just a packer, but a carpenter, understanding structure. He had been thinking about this problem for years, observing the trunks in the workshop. He explained his ideas to her, speaking not just of packing the dresses, but of protecting them, proposing new designs, lighter wood, and smarter ways to organize the inside of a trunk. The Empress, who was surrounded by people who simply said yes, was profoundly impressed by his quiet confidence and deep knowledge. She hired him on the spot. He was now Louis Vuitton maletier personnel de Sa Majesté l'Impératrice, the personal boxmaker to Her Majesty the Empress of France. He had won her trust, but Louis did not just want to work for royalty, he wanted to build his own name. Having the Empress as a client changed everything. Louis was now the most talked about, most respected maletier in all of Paris, and the nobility of France, wanting to be as fashionable as their Empress, all came to him. But Louis knew that his time as an employee was over. He had revolutionary ideas that went far beyond just packing. In 1854, using the powerful reputation he had built, Louis Vuitton made his final, boldest move. He left the workshop of Monsieur Maréchal, his teacher, and opened his very own business on a street in Paris. He hung a simple sign over the door, Louis Vuitton, maletier, his own name, his own destiny. And here he did not just sell trunks, he started a revolution. At that time, all travel trunks had rounded, curved tops, an old design meant to let rain roll off. But this design had a huge problem. They could not be stacked. On the new trains and steamships, this was a disaster. Louis introduced his great invention, the twist that changed everything. He created a trunk that was flat on top. It was made of light poplar wood, the same kind he knew from his childhood. And to address the rain, he covered the trunk not in heavy leather, but in a new, special waterproof canvas he called Trianon. It was gray, elegant, light, and completely waterproof. This invention was the resolution. His flat, stackable trunks were an immediate, massive success, proving to be the perfect solution for modern travel. His business did not just grow, it exploded. Dukes, bankers, international travelers, and royalty all demanded a trunk from Louis Vuitton. The homeless boy who had walked 470 kilometers with nothing in his pockets had not just built a shop, he had built an empire, changing the way the entire world traveled. Let's take a quiet moment and look back at this incredible journey. If we look at Louis's life from above, it feels like this. The story begins with a young boy named Louis Vuitton in a small, poor village in France. He was the son of a carpenter, and he learned how to work with wood, how to make things strong and beautiful. His life was simple, but it became very hard. When he was just 10, his mother died, and later his father married a woman who was very cruel to Louis. His home was no longer a happy or safe place, so at just 13 years old, he made a choice that would define his destiny. He decided to leave. He began to walk to Paris, a journey almost 300 miles long. He had no money and no map. For 2 full years, he walked, sleeping in barns and working small jobs in towns along the way, just to get enough food to eat. When he finally arrived in Paris at 16, he was homeless and had nothing. But he had his skills. He found a job as an apprentice for a famous boxmaker named Monsieur Maréchal. For years, Louis worked harder than anyone. He swept the floors and learned the craft, eventually becoming the best boxmaker in the workshop. His skill became so famous that the Empress of France, the wife of Napoleon III, heard about him and hired him to be her personal boxmaker. This was the great opportunity he had worked for. Standing in the palace, the homeless boy was now serving royalty. With this new, powerful reputation, Louis made his final move. In 1854, he opened his own shop. But he didn't just copy the old designs, he introduced his great invention, a travel trunk that was flat on top so it could be stacked, and it was covered in waterproof canvas. This one idea changed travel forever. The poor boy from Anche, who had nothing but a dream and strong hands, used his skill and persistence to build a company that would become famous all over the world. Now, let us listen to the story one more time, but this time from a different perspective, from inside the heart of Louis Vuitton himself. I remember the cold in my village and the smell of sawdust in my father's workshop. I loved that smell. I loved the wood. But I also remember watching the great carriages pass by. I would watch them until they were just a small dot on the road, and I wanted to know, where were they going? I wanted to see a world that was bigger than my village. When my mother died, my world went dark. The house was not a home anymore, and my stepmother's voice was as cold as the winter wind. I felt so alone, knowing I could not stay. I thought, if I stay here, my spirit will break. I had to leave, even though I was only 13, because I knew I had to find my own way. That journey, walking to Paris, I will never forget. I was so hungry. Sometimes, for days, I ate nothing but what I could find. I was so tired, my feet were bleeding, and I wanted to give up 1,000 times. But I just kept thinking about Paris. I thought, if I can just make it there, I can work. I am a good worker. I could not stop. When I finally saw the city, I was terrified. It was so big, so loud. I had never seen so many people. I slept on the streets, cold and scared. But I found work. I found Monsieur Maréchal's workshop. I just focused on the wood in my hands, telling myself, work harder than everyone else, learn more than everyone else. And I did. The day I was called to the palace, my hands were shaking. I was standing in front of the Empress of France, me, a boy who had slept in alleys. But when she spoke to me about her problem, my fear went away. I wasn't a poor boy anymore. I was a craftsman. And I truly knew I could solve her problem because my skills were strong. When I finally opened my own shop, I painted my name on the sign, Louis Vuitton. It was more than just my name. It was my promise. It encompassed everything I had learned from my father, every kilometer I had walked, every piece of wood I had shaped. I did not just put my name on that sign, I put my entire life's journey on it. The story of Louis Vuitton did not end when he opened his shop. It was only the beginning. His company would grow, passing to his son and then his grandson. It would survive wars and massive changes in the world, but it always remembered the lessons of its founder, a deep respect for craft, a drive for innovation, and an untiring passion. Understanding that true quality is timeless. That incredible journey from a poor village in Anche along a 470-kilometer road to the palaces of Paris did not happen by magic or by luck. Louis's destiny was not something he was given, it was something he built step by step with his own hands. That is our simple lesson for tonight. Destiny is not something we are given, it is something we build with our own hands. If this story helped you practice your English, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories to help you learn. And tell us in the comments, what is a dream you are working hard for? You can also listen to this story again, perhaps tomorrow, to practice your speaking and understanding. Thank you for listening, and good night.